Last time, we stood in a room in Buckingham Palace, the 7th of April, 1853. A queen, a folded handkerchief, a few drops of chloroform, and the moment the world decided that a woman was allowed to feel no pain while giving birth. That was a story about permission, about whether suffering had to be endured. Victoria settled that question for the world, but she didn't answer the harder one. Because chloroform on a cloth doesn't target anything. It takes the whole person down towards sleep. It can't numb only the pain of birth and leave a mother awake, talking, moving, present for the moment her child arrives. Nobody in that palace knew how to do that. The tool didn't exist. That problem, how to switch off pain in one region of the body and nowhere else, would take another 68 years to solve. And the man who solved it would be dead within 3 years of publishing it. His discovery forgotten, his name erased from the technique he invented for half a century. This is part 2. This is how the epidural was actually born. Quick note before we get into it. What you're seeing on screen is an AI avatar, a digital version of me built from my own voice and my own likeness. The words are mine, the science has been thoroughly reviewed, and the cases are thoroughly researched. Because I'm a working anesthesiologist. My day job is in the operating room, not in front of a camera. This avatar is how I keep showing up here, between cases. Here is my commitment to you. I bring you the cases that shape the world we live in and the people we love, the ones that change how medicine is practiced, and the ones you need to know about before you or your family ever step into a hospital. So please like, subscribe, and enjoy. Now, back to the case. This is how the epidural was actually born. And this is what an epidural really is. His name was Fidel Pagés Miravé. In 1921, he was a military surgeon in Madrid in his mid-30s, with a reputation built in the worst possible classroom, the Spanish field hospitals of the wars in Morocco. War surgery teaches you speed, and it teaches you the limits of the tools you have. And the tool every surgeon of his era was wrestling with was pain control that didn't endanger the patient. There was already spinal anesthesia. You could put local anesthetic directly into the cerebrospinal fluid and produce a dense total block below the waist. It worked, but it was all or nothing. Once it was in, it was in. You couldn't dial it up, dial it down, or extend it if the operation ran long. And the deeper you went, the more the patient's blood pressure could collapse. Pagés was after something more controllable, and he found it in a space most people didn't even think of as a space. Just outside the sac that holds the spinal fluid, outside the dura, there is a thin sleeve of fat and veins and connective tissue, millimeters wide, the epidural space. Pagés realized that if you could place anesthetic there outside the fluid, you'd get a different kind of block. Slower to take hold, less dense, but controllable in a way spinal anesthesia never was. The problem was finding it. Miss by a millimeter too far and you puncture the dura. Stop a millimeter too soon and the drug goes nowhere. How do you feel your way to a space you cannot see in a living person with a needle? Pagés' answer was strange and beautiful, and it relied on a quirk of physics inside the human spine. The epidural space is at slightly negative pressure. It gently pulls inward. So Pagés placed a small drop of fluid in the hub of his needle and advanced slowly through the tough ligaments of the back. As long as the needle tip was still in dense tissue, the drop sat there untouched. But the instant the tip crossed into the epidural space, that faint negative pressure sucked the drop inward. The drop disappeared. It was a signal you could see. A hanging drop, vanishing, telling the surgeon, you are exactly where you need to be. Not too shallow, not too deep. There. He called the technique metameric anesthesia, segment by segment, because you could target the bands of the body served by particular spinal nerves. He wrote it up. He described the cases. He laid out the advantage that still defines the epidural today. You could control the duration and the depth in a way spinal anesthesia simply could not allow. He published it in 1921 in the Revista de Sanidad Militar, the journal of the Spanish Military Medical Corps, in Spanish, in a national journal that the wider world of anesthesia, working in English, French, and German, did not read. 2 years later, in 1923, Fidel Pagés was killed in a car accident. He was in his late 30s. His paper went quiet. The technique he had invented went with it. Here is where this stops being a sad story about one man and becomes something stranger, a thing that happens in science more often than we like to admit. In 1931, 10 years after Pagés, an Italian surgeon named Achille Mario Dogliotti, working in Turin, published a technique for reaching the epidural space. He had never read Pagés. He didn't know the Spaniard existed. He had arrived at the same anatomical destination completely on his own. And Dogliotti's method of finding the space was, if anything, even more elegant. Instead of watching a drop, he pushed gently on the plunger of a syringe as he advanced the needle. Through the tough ligaments, the plunger wouldn't budge, the tissue resisted. But the moment the tip slipped into the epidural space, the resistance vanished and the plunger gave way, the fluid flowing freely into the space. Loss of resistance. It's the technique anesthesiologists around the world still use to place an epidural today. When I place one, this is the sensation in my hands I'm reading for. Firm, 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 and then suddenly give. Dogliotti published in the international journals in the languages the field actually read. His work spread fast, and for decades the textbooks credited him with the epidural. It took medical historians years to go back, find the Spanish paper, and establish that Fidel Pagés had described it first, a full decade earlier. By the time the record was corrected, Pagés had been dead for 50 years. He never knew the world eventually learned his name, and now the two halves of this story come together. Remember the problem Victoria's chloroform couldn't solve, numbing only the pain of birth, leaving the mother awake and present? The epidural is the answer that arrived too late for her, but in time for almost everyone after. Once you could place a fine catheter into that epidural space and leave it there, you could top the anesthetic up for hours. You could run it through an entire labor. You could give a mother enough relief to rest and still let her stay conscious, talking, pushing, awake for the first cry. The thing that didn't exist in that palace in 1853 became, over the 20th century, the most common form of pain relief in childbirth on Earth. By the 1970s, the epidural dominated labor analgesia. By the 2000s, it was standard for major abdominal and chest surgery too. Today, a large share of women delivering in American hospitals, by many estimates well over half, will receive an epidural at some point in their labor. Every one of them is the inheritor of a needle, a negative pressure space, and a vanishing drop of fluid that a forgotten Spanish surgeon watched disappear 100 years ago. That is what an epidural is, not a drug that puts you under. A precisely placed catheter that interrupts pain signals in a band of the body and leaves the rest of you awake to live the moment it's protecting you from. There are two lessons here, and they pull in different directions. The first is about recognition, and it isn't comforting. Fidel Pagés did everything right. He observed carefully, he reasoned clearly, he invented something genuinely new, and he published it. And it still vanished. Not because the work was wrong, but because the field of his day read mainly English, French, and German, and his paper, published in Spanish in a military journal, sat outside the circles where the discovery would have spread. And because he died before he could carry it any further. Being first is not the same as being remembered. The history of medicine is not a clean record of who deserved credit. It is a messier record of who was read. The second lesson is the one I want the students and residents watching to actually keep. The epidural you will place hundreds of times in your career did not come from a single flash of genius. It came from two people a decade and a country apart, both patiently solving the same tiny physical problem. How do you find a space you cannot see? A hanging drop, a loss of resistance. Small, careful answers to a small, careful question, and the result reshaped childbirth and surgery for the entire world. So when you feel that give under your thumb, firm, firm, then suddenly free, know that you are repeating a gesture two men discovered separately, and that one of them never got to hear his own name attached to it. Do the careful work anyway, publish it anyway, teach it anyway. Whether or not the record ever catches up to you, the patient in front of you receives the whole inheritance. I'm Dr. Karen Francois. This was the story of the epidural, the discovery that happened twice, and the man that history almost forgot.